It says you will be live soon, and it is going slow. Oh, you are live.
All right. Hi, and welcome to the end of day one session, the next normal, CTEK's new services to support adapting in 2020 and beyond. I'm Mike McCune, the Northwestern Client Services Director here at CTEK. And before we get started, as a reminder, I had a few housekeeping items I wanted to go over. Just to remind you, on the right side of your panel, of your screen, is the communications panel. And for technical difficulties, use the chat tab to ask the moderators a question, etc. You go through that chat tab. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the session by using the Q&A tab. All submitted questions will be addressed during the Q&A session after the speaker is finished. And at the end of each session, before the Q&A, I invite you to take a quick one-question poll on how you enjoyed this session. This will help cater our content for next year's user conference. Also, when the slides are displayed, you can click full screen by clicking the computer in the bottom right corner of the slides. Now to get started, I would like to introduce Ben Dankers, CTEK's own Senior Vice President of Security and Privacy Services. He is responsible for supporting the growth and ensuring effective and efficient service delivery and achieving our high levels of client satisfaction that we enjoy here at Synergistek Security. Prior to his time here at CTEK, Mr. Dankers was VP of Consulting at Cylance. So without further ado, Ben, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. You made it to the first day. Welcome to the last session of CTEK, the CTEK 2020 Summit. I'm excited to be here today to get a showcase where our solutions are headed. So as Mike said, the title of this presentation really is the next normal. What is normal anymore, right? The paradigm of life, security, everything in between is constantly shifting. As we have been continually setting our eyes on the future, whether you're really either progressing or digressing, right? There is no option to stay stagnant. I'm excited to discuss kind of our new path forward and look forward to hearing feedback as we start to accelerate some of our new offerings. So with that, a little bit about me. I hack stuff. I do incident response, and I'm passionate about risk and security. I have been doing security consulting and incident response for about the last 20 years. I started out at Guidance Software. I went to Foundstone, Intel, and I most recently ended up at Cylance, where I ran North America Consulting. I've had the opportunity to work for many industries, including healthcare. That gives me a really unique perspective on how it relates to certain goals. Although I've been at Synergistek less than a year, for the majority of that time that I've spent here, I've been under travel restrictions. I certainly look forward to getting to know each of you in the coming months. So with that said, what is our next normal? And that really looks like our Managed Security Validation Program. This is really an evolution of our CAP program, or CTEK Advantage Partner Program, that some of you may be more familiar with. This next step in our progression really allows CTEK to adapt to the ever quickly changing threat landscape while providing flexible options to help your organization continue to mature both your security and privacy programs. Our goal with this program is really to better enable each organization to achieve your specific security and privacy objectives. We want to build upon the original CAP and provide a flexible route with a predictable budget to ensure organizations such as yours have the best chance against attack tools, techniques, and procedures that your adversaries use, right? The CAP you have all grown to love isn't going anywhere. We're simply progressing the concept to add additional capabilities as it relates to risk validation and threat intelligence. So we've really kind of segmented our managed security validation program into 4 lifecycle components. You have assess, build, manage, and validate. Starting with assess, this is really the foundation CAP was built on. It focuses on identifying risks and security in your privacy program. As you will see, this over time has grown in terms of capability. We can look and assess risk of a program, policy, product, architecture, device, etc. No matter what the challenge, we have the people or partners to help you achieve your security and privacy goals. If we move down onto the build section, we really want to help enhance your current program or technology, maybe architecture. Perhaps you're considering implementing something. Our team can help from building out the action plan or providing the hands-on keyboard support to enable compliance or continue progression with your very own specific initiatives. CTEC recognizes that with increased budgets and staff often getting a checklist of what's wrong doesn't do anything. It's not going to solve the problem. Our build and remediation team is really there to support you in whatever needs necessary. If we move over to the left and we have managed, and this is really part of kind of what we've changed as it relates to the managed security validation program. Often it's a lack of resources that prevents things from getting done. We're here to help manage either tactical or strategic portions of your security and privacy programs. API Sentry, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Patient privacy monitoring, vendor security management, staff augmentation. These are all examples of areas we can help. Lastly, we have Validate, and this is where I really start to get excited because it's near and dear to my heart. We have started to build several new offerings and partnerships that revolve around continuously validating controls and safeguards that you guys have in place. We live by the trust but validate concept. So sorry about that. Next slide. So let's start talking, jump right in about some of those advanced offerings, right? The first one being security control validation, or our SCVA. The next one I'll talk about briefly is Project API Sentry. And lastly, our 24/7 adversary validation. Starting off, our SVCA at a really high level, this service measures the effectiveness of your implemented safeguards. Perhaps you've heard of the concept of a purple team exercise before. This is our version of it. It lets us dig in, understand what safeguards are working, optimize, missing, or duplicative from a technical control perspective. Next up, we have Project API Sentry. We feel that API security in general is really misunderstood and rarely addressed, right? Additionally, and you'll hear me talk about this quite a bit throughout the presentation, interoperability and information blocking requirements will require you to start providing third-party access to customers' data. With APIs being being a blind spot for most organizations, we've developed a process, I should say, to help manage those APIs both on demand and continuously to assess potential risks. Not only does it aim to protect you, but your customers as well. Lastly, 24/7 adversary validation. In my mind, the best defensive playbooks are built using your opponent's offensive plays. Our approach is to have an affordable way to identify attack paths all year round. With the threat landscape changing, this is more of a requirement than a nice to have. The trick, of course, with any of this is finding a cost-effective way to handle it, which is what we've attempted to do. So I want you to sit there and imagine for a second that I've just developed the most amazing bulletproof glass, right? It will stop everything, including that quote-unquote silver bullet. Now, I tell you, you have to stand behind it in order to experience this bulletproof glass that I've created, so that you can experience it in its full. Pretty much all of you are going to want to see some sort of credible proof that it works and won't fail before even considering taking me up on that offer. Our security control validation is really designed around that concept. We want to be able to test your safeguards. How many times have we thought we were prepared, yet ended up forgetting something? So oftentimes critical. As an example, the comic, right? We brought the bungee cord, we put on our safety gear, and we sent it. Yet we simply forgot to attach the cord before jumping, right? Some basic blocking and tackling. You guys spend countless dollars on safeguards within your technical stack, firewall, SIMs, maybe DLP. SCVA allows us to test those safeguards with real-world attack techniques, tools, and evaluate the procedures that you guys are using day in and day out. We help identify what needs to be optimized, what can be replaced, or what needs to be implemented. As an output, you can provide your board or senior executive staff with concrete evidence that shows both the positive impact your decisions have made and where there's still maybe room for growth. This allows not only for prioritization, but also helps making sure that you guys are making the right investments in the right areas. And then lastly, what's better than a real immersive IR exercise? Use these assessments as an ability to train and identify process breakdowns in IR capabilities. Is part of your program outsourced? Test their capabilities to understand the value your MSSP brings or doesn't. Imagine spending millions of dollars to find out the protection you thought you were getting doesn't actually exist, or there are gaping holes. So in terms of like a self-assessment, from a self-assessment perspective, I want you to kind of think about these bullets here on the slide. Questions to really ask yourself, right, is you may trust what you have what you need. However, SCCA allows you to validate using real-world attacks. What gaps do you have in your technology stack? How do they impact you? How well are they optimized or configured? Do you guys have redundant technology that could be decommissioned and that funding being used elsewhere? What needs to be enhanced within your current security operations center or managed security service provider to ensure they are identifying everything they should? Another question, how would your technical controls hold up against a real world attack? SCVA allows you to not only build custom scenarios like ransomware or insider threat to test the various safeguards in place. So how does SCVA work? This slide will give you a very quick overview of how the process is implemented. This example that I put on the slide is as basic as it comes. You have an organization that is protected by a firewall, an external DMZ, maybe there's an internal SIM, but that's about it. In terms of the general process, your organization is going to be much more complex. It doesn't necessarily change how our assessment works. This is just for visualization perspective. So first thing we do is after identifying the scope and test scenarios, virtual machines are deployed in the key areas on the network. Then we run our scenarios. The attacks are inoculated, meaning simulations and non-malicious. After that, we then look at logs from each safeguard and scope, safeguard being in this case the firewall. However, as I mentioned before, you could have safeguards like NAC, DLP, SIM in a more traditional environment. Then we look at, was the attack successful? Were we able to successfully deploy ransomware? Were we able to exfiltrate data? Did it get logged? Did it get blocked? What happened? And those logs are collected from the SIM and the safeguard itself to understand, and then they're analyzed to understand exactly what happened for each type of attack. Lastly, we map that to the MITRE ATT&CK framework for managing and tracking each type of potential compromise. And this is important because it allows you to start visualizing what controls, again, are working versus not. So at the end of the assessment, you'll get a report showing what safeguards work or didn't for each of the in-scope attack scenarios. We built specific tactical and strategic recommendations to not only solve the immediate issue, but also looking to address the systematic issues at hand. These can certainly be a combination of process or technology. Should you need help with implementation or any of these recommendations that we provide, we've got you covered as well. If you remember at the beginning, I talked about a little bit about our build and remediation teams. So the idea here in concept is that we're not just saying, here's a bunch of stuff that you need to fix. We're here to support you in whatever capacity you may need us. Now, let's talk about our API Sentry, or Project API Sentry, as I like to call it. So we've recognized really that our customers need to have a solution to address API security at all stages. Right? We have several customers where development is part of everyday life, and they need a way to dynamically or statically assess those APIs within their SDLC process prior to them hitting production. Additionally, you have interoperability requirements and information blocking requirements that are going to allow third-party APIs into your environment. We feel that that is an incredibly risky situation if you do not know what these APIs do, right? So we feel the need to test not only those APIs, whether it's one time a quarter or on a continuous basis, but considering the type of data that is going to be requested, it could potentially be a big deal. So what we've done is partnered with an organization called APISec, and what APISec allows us to do is not only utilize their tool, but to build playbooks utilizing artificial intelligence that assess specific business logics, use cases designed specifically for each API. And I'll talk about a little bit more later on in the presentation, but it's the artificial intelligence that allows us to stay ahead of the attack curve, which we find most interesting. Additionally, we also build a report that can be then used to not only address the findings or fully integrate it into a DevOps or security ticketing solution. And lastly, we build in quarterly touch points to either update the APIs that you want tested or to just do a check-in to ensure that your API security strategy is on track and where you need to go. So what is an API, right? At the most basic level, an API is simply logic that's been defined that allows interaction between applications or systems and services. Think about every time you log into Facebook and the 1,000 Candy Crush or other random requests that you may get. Those are applications that are using an API in order to interact with Facebook, as an example. Or think about every single application on your iPhone or third party that interacts with a device. Something like a health monitor, Fitbit, something that will eventually require access to probably their own users' data at potentially your EHR. So what's the need, right? There have been several large data compromises in the recent years, simply because the business logic utilized within the API wasn't prepared or properly secured. Facebook, Venmo, Salesforce, all large public organizations have had massive data breaches simply because their APIs were not properly secured. Imagine if that data was ePHI or something similar. APIs, from my perspective, also tend to get missed as it is related to the security program. Web application assessments, SOC 2, HITRUST, they don't cover the technical complexities that API business logic typically has. Generally, it falls into the category of a web application. However, it is really its own thing. Manual assessments or methods of API assessments absolutely exist. However, they are time consuming, especially considering the volume of APIs typically found in your environment. You may have hundreds, and to do a single assessment on an API, for example, manually could take weeks. And that's why we really like leveraging the technology, because the artificial intelligence speeds up that process, where instead of taking 4 weeks to do an assessment, we can review that in a matter of hours. Additionally, your average security analyst doesn't necessarily have the experience needed to adequately address the risk. And most important, and for the third or fourth time, with interoperability and information blocking, you now have to deal with third-party APIs without understanding the risks associated, right? So with those kind of rules coming into place next year, you're certainly going to have additional risks you're going to need to take into consideration. So let's do a self-assessment from an API security perspective, right? Have you ever reviewed your APIs? Usually, if someone answers yes, they are at best talking about a web application pen test or something similar. As previously mentioned, unless the assessment reviewed the actual business logic that was developed for the API, which in most cases it won't, then the API hasn't been assessed. Let's talk about, how does your security program identify APIs to begin with? Simply understanding how many APIs in your environment you have, or even if they have the business logic documented as to how or what it's supposed to be used for, can often be worse than a traditional asset management program, which we all know is problematic, to say the least, in most cases. What about, would you know if your API was being abused? Would you know if the API was allowed to, say, exfiltrate data to a malicious third party? What if you're doing in-house development, right? How is API security being implemented into your SDLC process and validated every time change occurs? These are all things that we have to think about as it relates to how we're going to deal with API security, both from a privacy and security program perspective. So now I want to talk a little bit about kind of the partnership advantage that we have with APISec, and specifically, as I mentioned, traditional methods like web application firewalls or API gateways, they simply don't cover the basis of even the OWASP top 10 API security threats, right? So API Sentry, powered by APISec, allows us the ability to address the area of API security heads on. We take pride in the ability to utilize the technology, specifically the AI, to look for not only what's known attacks, but also unknown attacks, both statically and continuously, right? So instead of just having a point in time, we can now have the ability to look at risks continuously day in, day out as it relates to a specific API. And finally, let's transition to the 24/7 adversary validation service. And I like to start this off with kind of a question. Specifically speaking, what percentage of vulnerabilities do you guys patch? And this answer to me is always fascinating because you could ask 10 people at the same organization and you could get 12 different answers. And it's actually a pretty tricky question to answer, because you have to ask yourself, well, are you talking about OS patches? Are you talking about third-party application patches? What about in-house, grown in-house legacy applications? Or what about Linux? What about medical device? What about IoT? I mean, literally, I could go on and on and on about devices that you need to have patching around. The sad truth, though, right, and the reality is even if you patch 99% of them, that's still 1% of devices that could potentially be compromised, right? One click on an email to start a domino effect. My next question is really, what about all the attacks that don't require a vulnerability per se? LLMNR and NBT poisoning, credential sniffing, man-in-the-middle attacks. What kind of visibility do you have to those threat vectors? And so this is why we wanted to build this concept in solution to kind of your traditional annual internal pen test and have 24/7 adversarial validation, right? I'll go ahead and build up the slide real quick. We wanted a solution that was somewhat automated, could be intelligent. It's a lot less hands-on than a full red team assessment. It's not meant to replace a red team assessment by any stretch of the imagination. Pen testing, red team assessment are still critical parts of your security program, and they need to be done, on a fairly regular basis. However, adversary validation was designed to continuously assess various parts of the environment by not only identifying and exploiting weaknesses, but trying to find those attack paths that aren't easily found. We've also, in the last couple of months, built the CTEC Red Team, which is responsible for our attack and adversarial activities. They actively monitor this solution within your environment, evaluating the output as needed. Our solution is designed around actual exploitation. So if we find a path to domain admin, as an example, rest assured, it's not going to be a false positive. We actually were able to find a path from unauthenticated to that of domain admin. False positives are a thing of the past as it relates to our validation service. Next, let's talk about kind of the goal of this service, right? Really, it's to evaluate attack paths and identify potentially missed areas of risk. With that said, all active exploitation is done using proven and reliable exploit code, right? And anytime I say exploit code, that some of I tend to get a lot of questions, but understand that, furthermore, each of these attack sequences can be customized within the environment. So we don't have to automatically send out and automatically exploit boxes. We can decide based upon the test, the scenario, the environment, the target, as an example, what kind of threshold we want to do in terms of automation. So there's always checks and balances in areas to continue to, from an automation perspective, to manual intervention. And I think that's really important to understand. And so after you've gone through a sequence and we've looked at a set of targets, the reporting outlines all of the attack paths found with a full set of recommendations, right? We look to highlight, accounts that have been compromised, maybe passwords that were cracked. Again, these are attack paths or risks that you would not necessarily have visibility today, simply because of the way that they were identified. And then lastly, there's no agents to install, right? This is an attack platform that is standalone and a self-contained unit. So you don't have to worry about pushing out product. You don't have to worry about that interfering with anything. It's a standalone unit that runs by itself. We just point it where it goes as we talked about at the beginning in terms of defining scope, and let it do its thing. So I want to do a quick level setting about vulnerability scanning versus pen testing, right? So vulnerability scanning is not pen testing. Vulnerability scanning is really just looking to identify vulnerabilities in an automated function. Pen testing is typically the art or of exploitation or looking to exploit vulnerabilities. Oftentimes you'll have a pen test that may incorporate vulnerability scanning as part of its process, and both are important parts of your overall security and privacy strategy. But I wanted to make sure that everybody understood that there are two distinct things. And that kind of leaves me into, well, vulnerability scans aren't enough. And here's an example of an attack chain performed that allowed for credentials to be captured. These credentials were then provided access to a system where hashes could be cracked to eventually lead to domain admin privileges. This is just one example of a risk identified that would have otherwise gone unnoticed. Just like this, in terms of going from unauthenticated, within a couple of steps, the domain was completely compromised. And a vulnerability scan wouldn't have seen this or been able to follow the attack chain down its process. Often I should say during a pen test, we find a vulnerability scanners rate a single vulnerability, low or medium, as an example. But from an attacker's perspective, we may be able to leverage that medium or low vulnerability to provide us with additional intel to then formulate an attack. We may not be able to compromise a host directly using that single low or medium vulnerability, but if we have 5 or 6 medium or low vulnerabilities, it may be enough for us to be able to plan an appropriate attack. And knowing how to truly prioritize those issues is important, as any vulnerability can leave you compromised. So why the need? And really that boils down to APTs, right? Or they don't even necessarily need to be advanced persistent threats, just threats in general. They are very standard these days, as everyone here is well aware. The question is how are you adjusting to your remote workforce, but with it increasing? Is there additional threats users themselves are creating? You've just increased your potential attack surface by having a lot of your organizations potentially work from home, and in every unmanaged home there's devices now on the same network with users who are potentially less aware of at-home risks. Perfect example of this is we just had a discussion a couple of days ago where the school district was sending devices home and required the parents to use them in their own environment, right? Well, we have corporate laptops, and there's going to be a lot of devices on the same network. However, you have no idea how secure those devices are, and so you need to make sure that the controls you have in place, the best controls you have on your corporate devices or assets, regardless of if they're plugged into your internal network or remotely at home or at Starbucks, as an example. And so, ultimately, you could either use the security control validation assessment to test the effectiveness of some of those controls, or if you want a long-term outlook on how that is working, adversary validation is potentially a very good option for that, because we can start to evaluate some of those risks. And really, what solution do you have in place right now for testing things like lateral movement or credential stealing, right? Can you even spot that in your environment if it were to happen today? You maybe have endpoint protection. I would hope you'd have endpoint protection, but if valid credentials are stolen or used, it becomes very difficult to identify. And so it would be from our perspective, right, being able to identify those gaps and weaknesses allows us to build an appropriate either roadmap or case study or plan in order to have the proper corrective actions be made. And I would say, lastly, kind of at best, organizations are doing an internal pen test 1 to 2 times a year, right? It doesn't take long to compromise a typical environment. Usually when we do an internal pen test, as of late, we're probably 85% of the time we're compromised within the first couple of days. Being better prepared allows for you to have future assessments where they really focus on weakness versus the low-hanging fruit. And this is what it does, right? If this automated solution can find issues and identify problems that lead to domain admin compromises, you have some serious blocking and tackling that you're going to have to address in order to have a shot at, say, a real red team exercise. And then, everybody would love to have a red team, triple team expertise at their fingertips, or even if you could source them to build your own team. However, resources are typically expensive, and of course it can be geographically challenging depending upon your location and where you live. And so those are all things to think about as well. So how does CTEC solve this problem, right? Well, we want to provide provide continual adversarial validation around the clock. It will continue to identify areas your organization needs to focus on every single day. This is an automated solution or semi-automated, depending on what your preference is, which lets us focus on what is exploitable and keeps costs low to ensure financial viability. If you had a full red team, the cost to staff that red team would be significantly higher than an automated solution such as this. It's really the next best thing to having a full-time red team, as an example. So you really get to access the CTEK Brain Trust with a solution like this as well. You have access to our internal red team. We can help provide direction when needed, provide advice. We have advisory services as well that can all be wrapped and baked in, really providing you guys with an opportunity to assess any part of your program from this moment forward. And then actual systems exploited or accounts compromised will absolutely help drive prioritization in terms of what you need to focus on and where you need to be, where your attention needs to be, right? Whether it's remediation or fixing gaps, actual vulnerabilities that have been exploited, generally speaking, jump to the top of the list, right? Because if you have a user click a phishing email and they can go from an authenticated user to that of domain admin, potentially a big deal. And those obviously need to take high prioritization opposed to systems or vulnerabilities that you haven't necessarily identified as being able to be compromised. And then lastly, you really get to track your grade, right? You get to show your progress over time. With our quarterly touch points, we're able to really help correct course as needed, whether that's quarterly, weekly, it's really up to you guys. But again, we're in this as a partnership, and from my perspective, it allows us to kind of build that rapport together and really not only help from a technical perspective, but as you start to do other services within the MSV, like our risk assessments, it really allows us to direct what your next actions need to be to have the biggest impact on, say, your risk score or something similar. So how does it work, right? And really, it's what the first thing that you have to do is define the attack surface, right? So what area do you want to focus on? You can change this on a weekly or quarterly touch points or on a more frequent needed basis. It just depends on where do we want to start. Second, you got to set the exploit parameters. So realistically, are you comfortable with automatically progressing through the attack chain? Do you want us to stop at a certain portion? This is all configurable and up to you, right? So we can either identify the vulnerability to exploit and then get us all the way to where we hit the button to say, okay, I want to exploit, or we can just stop there and set a time to exploit it, say after hours or something similar. The next thing is what is the actual exploit path? Really, how deep do you want us to go? If we capture an account or credentials that could allow us to, say, move laterally or move down the line, is that something you guys want to see? Doesn't have to be, but ideally that will show, how easy not only is it to compromise an account, but what the potential impact of having different account types and where privileges could be potentially escalated and what the consequences of that could be. After we've kind of done the assessment for that range or for that attack surface, we generate a report. That report provides highlights on the issues that we identified, what was exploited, what systems were vulnerable, how they were compromised, essentially the anatomy of the hack. If we crack passwords, we'll show those as well, weak passwords, et cetera, et cetera. Ultimately, this is where you get the most benefit, right? Because we went through this process, identified identified where the vulnerabilities were, what could be exploited, what was the result of the exploitation, and this is the output of that. And this happens, as frequently as weekly or quarterly. It just depends on how large of the attack service and how often we want to meet to discuss. And then next, right, we have within the recommendations themselves, oftentimes we have customers that just don't have the resources to do anything with them. So we can either help integrate those into your ticketing system or provide hands-on remediation through our build services as well. And again, you have access to the CTEK Brain Trust. So any questions during that process would be a perfect example of time that you would want to be able to spend with them to be able to help identify what the problem is, how you resolve it, and anything in between. Lastly, I understand that priorities change. You have access to us on an ongoing basis. So what you may want to attack one week may change the week 2. And you have access to us on that ongoing basis. So we can set up quarterly touch points, much like any of our other services, where we can determine what that looks like and what the frequency is as it relates to not only what you're targeting, but what types of attacks you may want to target as well. And with that, I will leave you with the final takeaways, right? So security control validation, again, just to wrap back up, essentially it allows you to assess the impact of attacks against your implemented safeguards. So you want to see what happens when you run a ransomware attack. You want to see what happens when you run data exfiltration. Our security control validation assessment will allow you to do that. It identifies those gaps, both in the technical stack and architecture, and then also it can be used to measure the effectiveness of, say, an internal security control SOC, or I should say internal security operations center, or managed security services provider. These are all examples of how this service can provide support. With our API Sentry service, interoperability requirements are going to, again, are really what's driving our need to put this out to the market, and that is because they're going to potentially allow third-party APIs to access your data, and with absolutely no real way to understand either the security of what those APIs contain as it relates to business logic, or what the potential impact if those are compromised. It's a pretty big deal, and really the solution allows us to review again any identified APIs statically or dynamically across a range of time, and evaluate those potential security risks. And then lastly, 24/7 adversary validation. Traditional pen testing, internal pen testing as an example, is only a point in time. This service provides access to you 24/7, and really is looking to allow you to incrementally change your security program and procedures based upon what we identify over the course of 12 months, right? So no longer do you just get a report, somebody scans, you get a report, and then you get a report next year. This allows you to build a more formal process around not only around exploitation and pen testing, but provides value in the sense that it gives you an additional view into areas you probably don't have today. Specifically speaking, those various attack chains and moving laterally across the network. And with that, I'll open it up for questions. I know I covered a lot in the time, but again, I haven't met a lot of you, given all of the specific travel restrictions. Please feel free to reach out to me should you have any questions, want to go in depth into any of the items I discussed. I'm happy and available at any time. And Mike, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Ben. We did get some questions that I'm going to go over here in a second. I did want to remind people that over to the right-hand side of your screen, there is the area with the chat, polls, people, and Q&A. And if you have a second to quickly answer the single poll that we have for this individual session, make sure that you do that before we all part here after our Q&A. And I will go ahead and start off with the first question that we received. I received these via messages. Let's see here. For control validation, do the results of the assessment align to any sort of known framework, or how do you see it aligning with the current risk assessment process that we undergo now?
Yeah, absolutely. So it aligns with our internal NIST framework, along with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, to provide max flexibility. And so they're absolutely interchangeable, and recommendations from the managed security validation assessment will directly show progress as it relates to, assuming we identify gaps and those gaps are corrected, will absolutely show progress as it relates to our standard NIST security risk assessment.
All right. And then the second question that I got was around the API service. For the API service, does the service include the ability to build an inventory of the APIs in use? If so, how would that work?
So we can help. That gets a little bit tricky, right, in terms of identifying all the APIs in use. However, what we also find is that if you have a list of APIs, the second most common problem of not understanding what your inventory of APIs are, so to speak, right, is what the business logic is. And we can absolutely help you identify and document what the business logic is. Think about like a Swagger file or something similar that can then be utilized from that moment forward. So it's not only just a matter of identifying the API, right? It's identifying what does the API do and how does it work from a business logic perspective. And so we can help with both. Although the management and asset discovery portion is a little bit tricky, right?
Yeah, I imagine that could be. All right. The third question is around adversary validation. Could you provide thoughts on how you'd approach including it in a program that already includes vulnerability management and periodic pen testing or red teaming to support those activities?
Yeah, absolutely. So from my perspective, the adversarial program is really designed to again find things long term, right? A pen test is a point in time. You can use the adversarial service to not only validate that what you're finding from a vulnerability scanning is incorrect, valid, right? Help reduce false positives there, but you're also going to identify attack chains and paths that you're not going to see elsewhere. And so that's not only valuable information to your security program, right? Because it allows you to identify maybe processes you need to change, maybe it's technical implementations that you need to change, but all of those things happen, from an automated perspective. And so the idea is that if you have an automated engine that is able to compromise your environment, you've got a lot of things that you probably need to work on. And so what that does is it allows you, once those things have been implemented and you get to your annual pen test or whatnot, you can really focus on goal-oriented testing that a red team is traditionally used for, right? So they're going to be a lot more strategic in nature, as opposed to, hey, I was able to scan your environment, I was able to find an exploit, I exploited, I got to domain admin, here's all your PHI data, thank you, goodbye, right? And so it allows you to expand that into a more strategic conversation to talk about not only threats, but also talk about your ability to how you can incorporate that maybe even into something like a purple team, where you're reviewing the results of the assessment with your internal SOC or MSSP.
Excellent. Well, and that's the end. I haven't received any additional questions via the QA or the chat messages. So we'll go ahead and thank you, Ben, for your delivering the message today. And I want to remind everybody to take a second to fill out the satisfaction poll under the communications tab off to the right. And as we look forward to tomorrow's sessions, I know I'm extra excited to hear from CTEC's Dave Bailey as he provides a deep dive into our annual report. And that will be hitting all of your mailboxes first thing in the morning tomorrow. And after the CTEC Summit is over, our marketing team will be following up with a survey asking if you need a certification of completion for your CEUs that are being assigned out from this. And we'll be sharing recordings from all of the sessions, so you can go back and listen to it again if there was something that you needed to cover again. And if you have any immediate need or would like to speak to one of our security consultants or your client service directors, feel free to reach out to us via the chat function that's in the communications tab, or you can email to marketing@synergistech.com. Thank you again for joining us. We appreciate all of you, and have a great evening, and we'll see you back tomorrow for day 2 of the 2020 CTEC Summit Virtual User Conference. Thank you and have a great evening.
Thanks, guys. It was fun.